Hi and welcome to the Gemhawks YouTube channel. I hope you're having a lovely day today. For our wire tutorial here on YouTube today, we are going to work on the Jewellery pendant. So this is crafted in copper wire. I'm going to take this off and show you on the board what we're looking to create, and then we'll make one together. So this is my variation of the Jewellery power symbol, which is from Reiki. Reiki was formed in Japan in the 1920s and literally means spiritual life force energy. I am not an expert by any stretch of the imagination. That is simply my understanding. So I'm going to share with you how to create this simplified copper pendant featuring that symbol which has been used for a century. The wire that we're going to use today is a raw copper in 1.25mm or 16 gauge, and I'm going to work with an 8-inch length. So as ever, I'm just going to warm that wire through by gripping one end of the wire and just running it between thumb and forefinger to ensure that it's smooth, fluid and ready to work. Another thing worth mentioning is that you should be flush cutting both ends before you get going. I'm going to use my memory wire finishing pliers, but you can use multi-step bail makers, memory wire finishing pliers, or indeed round nose pliers. When we start off, we're going to create the beginning of the spiral inside out. So normally one would start at the tail and move inwards, but to make this spiral really beautiful, we're going to work in the opposite direction, just so that we can control that flow of the wire. So usually, when I create a spiral in wire, what I will try to do is to get the cut end to sit against the path of the wire that falls away from it. In this instance, what I want to do is to keep that end open. So we're going to bring the wire around the central pin on the pliers. I'm just going to make sure that that's nice and smooth. I've created just over 2/3 of a circle, and then I'm going to allow the wire to continue forming in an even spiral. So rather than taking that cut end against the tail of wire here, I'm going to allow that to sit by itself. So we're going to bring that wire all the way around, and we're going to go for 3 wraps or 3 rotations from that start point. And in order to keep this looking beautiful, I'm going to endeavour to keep the gap between the wires the same as I move around. Now, if you are new to handling wire, you may mark the wire. I've been handling wire now for 15 years and I still mark the wire, which is one of the reasons I'm going to hammer this spiral, as well as the fact that it's a freestanding spiral in jewellery. And sometimes those little babies will catch on stuff. So this is our start point, and so far we have gone 2 turns, so we need to go 1 more turn of wire before we hammer this into place. So do take your time with making spirals and you'll find that they tend to form a little more evenly. So keep going until you've got that 3rd turn of wire. Now we will be bending the wire away. If I just pop this on the board for a second, if you imagine a line moving past the start point, we want that to be centralised in the spiral form. So you can use a piece of wire or a ruler or anything like that. So I know that I need to bring this wire just a little bit further around so that I've got those 3 full rotations of wire, and that's really important. Don't worry about bending the wire just yet. When we strike this spiral form on our steel block, we need to make sure that we don't hammer too closely to where the tail is moving away. So what I tend to do is just to hold that edge with my thumb, hammer around this area, and then flip it over and hammer on the other side, just being careful that we don't hammer this wire that's coming away, because we will want that to be nice and fluid and bend for us in a moment. So if I support the spiral frame in position, then I'm going to start striking as close to straight down as I possibly can, and avoiding my fingers preferably. Now, if you do manage to disrupt the flow of the spiral, you can give that a quick fix by just pinching together if you feel that that has come out of true. So in order to hammer the other side, I'm going to support where we've just hammered, and remember to not strike the tail of wire coming away. So once you've got your Jewellery spiral started off, you can reform that slightly should you need to. And we will move on in just a second to the next step of today's tutorial. So I'm just going to take a few extra seconds now to ensure that I'm happy with how that's coming together. One thing that you can do is hang the tail of the wire that you don't want to hammer off of the block and then cautiously hammer that area. You can also tape your wire to the block to ensure that you don't smush your fingers. Having spent several years in live TV demonstrations, you just learn not to swear when you do bosh the end of your finger with the hammer. So I'm going to take a few moments now just to make sure that I'm super happy with how that spiral is formed. And what I might also do is flip it over on to its other face onto the block and just hammer both sides to make sure that it's smooth and even. So when you're creating your spiral, just take a breath and be mindful of the process. This is one of those projects that I actually really enjoy creating, and I hope that you will too. So let's head back down to the board and we'll move on with the next stage of today's tutorial. So I have my spiral form. I've given it a quick rub down on the block with some wet and dry sandpaper pad. Given my block a bit of a rub down as well, but there we are. So what we're looking to have before we move further are 3 rotations from that start point. The start point being suspended equally in the centre as so. And then we're looking to have a straight line between the top, the tail of the wire and the base where the tail of wire is coming away just here. So we are ready to move on to our next stage. Now I may make a variation of this design later where I add the chakra colours up on the positions of the spiral, but today we're going to make a plain spiral pendant. So I'm just going to grip over a straight form, in this case my steel rule, and I'm just going to hold at the point where the wire leaves the spiral directly underneath that start point. So you can see if I just grip like so and then remove the straight line. What I'm going to do now is to draw the wire behind the spiral, and this is bearing in mind that our spiral is moving clockwise. So I'm just going to push that backwards to begin with, like so, and then I'm going to draw this upwards across the back of the design so that the piece of wire travelling up the rear passes the start point of our spiral in the centre there. So once I'm happy that that sits nice and neat and tidy, I'm just going to flip this over for a second and get a good straight line on this wire. So it can take a second just to make sure that you're entirely happy with that. And then I'm going to give that a bit of a pinch and sit it really flush against the rear of the design. When we pop this down on the board, we can see that the piece of wire that travels up the rear of the spiral passes the start point of our wire spiral. Before we move on to the next stage, I want to share a little tip with you. I've just flipped the design over to the rear side, and I'm going to keep the bulk of the spiral off of the block and just have the angle change. Once we've refined that to make sure that it's a really good strong angle, I'm just going to hold it like so and strike down to set really that right angle down at the bottom of the design. There's always a risk when you are hammering wire with wire underneath it that you will weaken the design, which is why we hang the spiral off the side of the block and allow that to sit down so that it cannot take any of the force of the hammering. So once you have set that angle in position, we can move on to the next stage. Now if it does come out of true at all, you can just bend that over, making sure that the wire on the rear of the design is completely centralised and transecting that start point in the middle of the spiral. What we're going to do now is to allow a gap up above the top of the spiral and bring that wire forwards, like so, and it's slightly larger than the gap between the last 2 passes of wire. That's because I'm going to create a round form through which we can add our necklace or threading material, and then I'm going to wrap once around that neck of the design, and then we're going to bring the tail out to the side. So you need to make sure that there is an extra gap at the top before you bring that angle forwards, to ensure that when you have wrapped around a round form to create the bail, that there is enough space for 2 passes of wire before it comes out to the left hand side. So I've just grabbed my multi-step bail makers, and I think I'll use step number 4 to create a round form just up at the top of that angle at the neck. Bring that all the way around, and now I've open spiraled that slightly, but that's absolutely fine because I can just pinch that up by hand. That's the beauty of working with a warmed raw copper. I'm just going to shrink that down slightly smaller. That looks decent to me, and I'm going to just pull the wire away, give it a bit of an extra warm through, and then I'm going to wrap the wire once around the neckline above the top of the spiral. So we've got our spiral here moving in a clockwise direction from the start point, and what we're aiming to do is to have the tail of wire going over to the left. So if I hold this in position, give that a bit of a warm through, because it's quite a firm wire, it's just a little more of a challenge to get it tightly around. So just make sure that's good and toasty warm, draw that all the way around. So we've travelled once around the neckline of the design, and I'm just going to tighten that up by squishing across like so, and then I'm going to ensure that the wire comes away to the left at the 9 o'clock position if the design was a clock face. So let's give that another squish, make sure that we're happy. Now before we move on, what I tend to do is just make sure that I'm happy with the roundness of that bail, and then I'm just going to strike down a couple of times. So that looks reasonably straight at the top. What I need to do now is make sure that we get a lovely straight line coming over to the side. Now you can have a look at images of this symbol online if you wish, just to make sure that you're happy with what kind of length you leave over to the side. I think I'm going to take off just the tiniest amount. Maybe just a little more. Yep, that looks about right to me. There probably is a perfect ratio that you can check to make sure that you are getting that to your own desires. So that looks reasonable to me. So now we've got to hammer this section that comes out to the side. Now it is very rare that I create jewellery with a sticky outy bit like this, but I think in this instance we're going to allow it. I think it works really, really well. So to ensure that you are going to hammer this into the perfect position, you need to make sure that your wire is completely straight in both orientations. We're also going to ensure that this wrap is completely done. It's very, very firm. So I'm going to pinch across that in a couple of different ways. If I mark the wire, I can polish that out again later. You could, of course, use a Dremel or other rotary polishing device. So there are multiple ways that you can hold this in position to make sure that you strike down flat. The first thing I'm going to do is just give it a quick hammer to make sure that I'm happy with how flat it is. Very, very softly in the opposite direction as well. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to start a stroke hammer. So I'm going to hammer down, but towards the end of the stroke of the hammer coming downwards, I'm going to swoop it away. And I'm going to do that a little softer towards the neck of the design and a little firmer towards the end of that tail wire. So I just hold that in the light. You can see that's already starting to flatten. So you can see already we've got a bit of a flare on the end here. So it does pay to make sure you have used the correct side of your flush cutters as well. I should have said that earlier. But you can also just give that a little bit of a smooth. Again, you can use a rotary device to get a really perfect finish on that. I'm definitely not doing that on screen because I'll probably polish my fingers off. So again, this is a wet and dry, so you can improve how much abrasion you get by adding some plain water to this. I have marked that wire, so I'm going to spend a few more minutes just stroking the hammer across that surface to make sure that I can get that lovely and smooth, but I'm sure you don't want to watch me doing that, so it's just more of the same, and I'll join you back in just a second. So I just polished out the end of that section just there by hammering down in exactly the same way, chasing the wire out to the one side, and I've given it a bit of a polish with my wet and dry sandpaper pad. So I hope that you have enjoyed the Jewellery pendant design today. If you'd like to see a variation of that with those chakra coloured beads added on the front, do let me know in the comments down below. If you've enjoyed today's video, please do consider a subscription to the channel, like the video, share the video and give it a hype. Thanks so much for watching. I look forward to seeing you again soon. Bye bye.